Hi, everybody. Welcome to 5 Questions with Persona. My name is Rob Simmelkjaer, and I am joined by State Senator Will Haskell of the state of Connecticut, who's running for re-election for the first time in his district in Connecticut, which includes lots of towns, including Westport, Wilton, Ridgefield, parts of New Canaan, Weston. It's a big district by space. Will, it's great to have you with us.
Really good to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Rob.
You got it. Thank you. So for those of you watching this, if you want to ask Will a follow-up question, you can download the Persona Talks app. Go to personatalks.com, look for Will Haskell, fire off a question, and he'll answer with a personalized video response. So Will, I want to dive into it. 5 questions. Question number 1, I look back on 2 years ago. You and I talked about your running for this seat. We thought it was a long shot, and then of course it happened. And you became sort of a political, I'll use the word superstar, in Connecticut and beyond with, I know you'll shake your head no, but, national press and 22-year-old kid just out of college being elected to state senate, endorsed by Barack Obama, not a small deal. So looking back now over the last 2 years, Will, you learned a lot about politics in that election. What have you learned about governing, the hard part of this, since you won that election in 2018?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. 2 years ago, my community took a chance on me. I decided to do something unusual and to come home and to start knocking on doors. And I can honestly say this job has been way more rewarding than I ever anticipated. One of the things that's really surprised me, one of the things I've learned about government, although it gets a reputation for being slow to adapt to changes and challenges, the fact of the matter is in just 2 years, we brought paid family and medical leave to Connecticut. We created a new tax credit to make it more affordable for young people to start their careers here. We passed 3 strong gun laws and weren't afraid in standing up to the NRA. Now, the challenges before Connecticut are enormous, right? We have more than 150,000 people who are unemployed. There are 43,000 teachers going back to work who are fearful that they don't have enough PPE to stay safe. We're not out of the woods by any means, but one thing I've learned is that state governments really do have a role to play in setting a national model. Connecticut's done really well in terms of containment, whether it's students in school or customers in stores or the government up here in Hartford. We take mask wearing seriously. We take social distancing seriously. We prioritize science. That's something that we're not seeing at the national level. So one thing I've learned is that state governments can try to set a tone and make up for the failed leadership that we're seeing elsewhere. They can be the first line of defense. And honestly, when I go out door knocking, Rob, what I hear from people is they are so happy to live in Connecticut these days.
Yeah, there's lots of reasons too, and a lot of people are moving to Connecticut for that very reason. Will, my second question is about the COVID crisis, which obviously has been the story of 2020 across many levels. How has this crisis changed your priorities when you look at what you hope to accomplish in the next 2 years?
So this election, I think, is now largely about healthcare, not just in containing the virus and in making sure that politics don't get in the way of public health officials, but perhaps most importantly, making sure that our community can afford healthcare at a time when it's most needed. Tragically, whether it's the cost of prescription drugs or the cost of insulin, we're seeing that the cost of healthcare is absolutely skyrocketing. We were able to make small progress, right, in passing the most aggressive cap on insulin in the country. But the big unfinished business, a big part of why I'm running again, is because we weren't able to pass a public option. Unfortunately, insurance companies and their lobbyists, they wield too much power up in Hartford. So as we face a public health crisis, as we face a Supreme Court that might be increasingly willing to gut protections for those with pre-existing conditions, let's make sure that small businesses and nonprofits and those who are self-employed can actually afford health insurance by creating a public option for all those who might want to use it.
Will, you talk about investing in things like healthcare, like higher education, which has been a priority of yours as well. We're looking at a $2.1 billion budget deficit, according to Comptroller Lembo in 2021. And that's just the beginning of potentially multiple years of fiscal challenges, given the fallout of COVID, and in addition to factors that existed before COVID impacted the state's economy. So when you talk about these investments, where does the money come from? How do you see the state finding a way to give more when it has so much less?
It's a really good question. We've got to double down on what already makes Fairfield County and Connecticut so appealing. When compared to 49 other states, Connecticut has spent a greater percentage of the federal aid we received from Washington on K through 12 schools than any other state in the country. That's what distinguishes our community. When I talk to new families who are moving out of Manhattan and into the suburbs, they say that they were drawn by the high quality of our public schools. So yeah, we've got no shortage of difficult budget decisions that lie ahead. I'm hoping that we're turning a page and beginning a more fiscally responsible future. I can tell you that I'm only one voice in the state Senate, but I spend a lot more time thinking about tomorrow's taxpayers than relitigating yesterday's mistakes. Absolutely, Republicans and Democrats for decades made irresponsible decisions, making expensive pension promises that they couldn't afford, and then failing to save even a penny towards those pensions. These days, here's the good news. If you sign up to work for the state government, you're not going to get an expensive Tier 1 pension or even a Tier 2 pension. You're going to get a Tier 4 pension that has a 403B, the public sector equivalent of the 401k you might see in the private sector. And the better news is we are fully funding those pensions, so the next generation of taxpayers doesn't inherit this mess. Look, everyone on the ballot this year, it seems, is running on a silver bullet to solve the pension crisis overnight. The reality is it took us decades to get into this mess, and it's going to take us some time to get out of it. But that's all the more reason to be optimistic that we have turned the page in Connecticut, that we're electing a new generation of leaders, and that there's some light at the end of the tunnel.
You think you can do that, though, deal with these long-term liability issues while also expanding services and adding things like, free community college and a public option for healthcare?
Yeah, I do. Partially because, yes, in the scheme of a lot of terrible news, Connecticut, there are some silver linings here in Connecticut. We have a $3.1 billion rainy day fund. That sets us apart from almost every other state in the country. When we saw increased tax revenue last year, rather than spending it, as is so often the habit here in Hartford, we decided to put it aside. By the way, that was a big fight. Many of my colleagues wanted to spend it on some short-term transportation improvements. Very tempting, but Governor Lamont and myself and many others said, you know what, let's make sure that Connecticut's protected in case we see a precipitous drop in tax revenue. Now that we're in the midst of a public health crisis that has become an economic crisis, Connecticut is able to keep the lights on, maintain critical services, invest in testing and school reopening and senior care, all of those crucial things because of that rainy day fund. We also actually are seeing a $30 million budget surplus. Now, that's only for this year. In the biennium, of course, we're still seeing that $2.1 billion deficit, but there's small reasons for optimism. And one more point, because Rob, I know you know this issue well, there are many folks in my community who commute into Manhattan and pay their income tax into New York State. Now, the law in both Connecticut and New York is that you should pay taxes in the state in which you are working at the convenience of your employer. No one is working from home out of their own convenience. They're doing so because their office buildings in Manhattan are closed. They've been asked not to be at their desk. Metro North isn't running the same sort of timetables. So I believe Connecticut has a really strong argument in actually bringing in new tax revenue from those who typically work in Manhattan. And by the way, this will amount to a significant tax cut for those commuters because Connecticut is a much lower rate than Manhattan. So perhaps it's me being naive, but I'm optimistic about Connecticut's future. I see a lot of reasons to throw up my hands, but I see way more reasons to roll up my sleeves.
You mentioned transportation, Will, and that leads to my fourth question in this conversation, which is about infrastructure improvements. You were right there with Governor Lamont in trying to get legislation passed to allow tolls, truck-only tolls for the most part. That obviously failed. The governor could not get the support he needed, particularly in the Senate, to get that done. Why did it fail, Will? Why do you think that didn't work? And what do you think the road ahead, so to speak, looks like in trying to get some improvements in Connecticut's infrastructure from a transportation point of view?
Oh, it's such a great question. It's not the $1 million question. It's the $1 billion question. Connecticut is often called the land of steady habits, but unfortunately, a lot of those habits are really bad. And I'm not blaming one side of the aisle or the other. A lot of my colleagues, because we run for office every 2 years, they're very hesitant to make politically unpopular decisions. That's not something that I've shied away from. Look, there are a lot of people in my community and across the state who say no tolls, but the first word to Connecticut's transportation future, it can't start with the word No. If you're opposed to tolls, tell me what you're for. We've got to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to modernize our roads, our rails, our bridges. Which taxes are you going to raise in order to make that possible? The way I'd prefer to do it is to ask the out-of-state drivers and the trucking companies to contribute to the wear and tear that they have on our roads. We as Connecticut taxpayers bear the sole brunt of funding our infrastructure, and it's fundamentally unfair, especially considering the fact, Rob, that my constituents pay tolls into New York, into New Jersey. I'll be paying them into Massachusetts tonight when I go up to visit my girlfriend. So I think Connecticut's getting the raw end of the deal, and I'm going to keep working on this issue. I recognize it might not be the most politically popular thing, but voters in this district and in Fairfield County, they deserve honesty and transparency and a real plan, not just a slogan that starts with the word no.
Well, my fifth question for you is just about your experience, as such a young person in state legislature, in the Senate, in fact. What has surprised you the most? What is the thing that you thought this would be like, and it turned out you were just completely wrong when it comes to just the experience of being an elected official, especially at such a young age?
Oh my gosh, there are so many things I want to say here, but I guess I'll condense it to, I'm surprised by the friendships that I've built with some of my older colleagues. I was really nervous that members of the legislature who have been here for longer than I've been alive, they might not take me seriously when I came into the building. And of course, there were some funny moments. I remember on the day that I was sworn in, the Senate president, who's been in office since the 80s actually, remarked that he was wearing a tie that was older than I was. But I went out and I found a tie that was older than he was, and I brought it to his office the next day. And we were able to build a friendship around it. So, there are always some difficult moments when you're the youngest person in the room, but I found that actually many legislators up here are excited about that long overdue promise that President Kennedy once made about passing the torch to the next generation. I think that millennials and members of Gen Z like myself, we get a bad reputation for being apathetic or apolitical, when in fact we understand that climate change, for example, isn't an academic anxiety, but it's an existential threat to our continued existence. And speaking up for those next generation of voters, I found is a really good way to connect with legislators of all ages and members of all parties. So, if you watch cable news, you think the Democrats and Republicans don't agree on anything. The fact of the matter is most of the bills that we pass in the state Senate are actually unanimous. And the vast majority of them, even the ones that aren't unanimous, are still bipartisan. So we're still able to get things done in the state capitol. And while Washington's talking about problems, my experience up here has been that Hartford's actually solving a lot of them. All
right. Well, Will Haskell, running for re-election in the 26th Senate District in the state of Connecticut, now no longer quite right out of college, one Senate term out of college, but running for another 2 years in the state Senate. Will, thank you very much for the time. Really appreciate it. Good luck the rest of the way to Election Day.
Thanks, Rob. Stay healthy.